Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Top of Mind webinar, the webinar series where we just get real security leaders talking about things that are interesting to them, and I just bet they'll be interesting to you as well. My name is Samuel Hill. I lead product marketing at Mind, and I'm joined, as always, by my counterpart, the field CTO at Mind, Landon Brown. Landon, how are you today? Exciting topic for us.
I'm excited to be here today. We do have an exciting guest, and I'll let you introduce Sam, but I think our topic today is timely with both the things we're working on here as a company and also what we're seeing in the market.
Yeah, AI, artificial intelligence is quite literally. I think cybersecurity companies get fined if they do not mention it at least 20 times per day. But at the end of it, though, we do need to focus on it's about people and working for a human-centered approach to AI security. So I am thrilled to introduce our guest today. His name is Maarten Van Horenbeeck. He is a cybersecurity fellow at Adobe and the past security officer at Adobe, and he's also held senior leadership security positions at Zendesk, Fastly, and Amazon, and has worked as best he can to help advance the cybersecurity industry with his own research and incident response playbooks and also nonprofit partnership. Maarten, welcome very much to the Top of Mind webinar.
Thank you so much, Samuel, and great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to talk about this. I know when you and I were introduced, your very first kind of idea was around human-centric design. And you don't hear that described very often in cybersecurity. Why is kind of a human approach or human centricity such an important thing for you?
So I would say for me, there were two big formative moments where I really realized that in the end, security is about people. And the very first one goes back to sort of the beginning of my career. So when I started working as a security engineer, in my spare time, I was helping a lot of nonprofits and minority groups with cybersecurity. And what made those organizations special was that they didn't actually often have corporate IT. They were just a community of people all working together, but they were seeing very, very sophisticated attacks at the time. And we're now talking about 2006, 2007. And as I was working with them and trying to give them advice on what to do next, there was no button you could push. You actually had to go talk to people, understand what they were doing, where they were running into risk, and then figure out with them how you could actually mitigate some of these problems. And that was really hard. And it wasn't like a typical enterprise security problem, but it really affected individuals because someone who was targeted in that sense often had connections or relationships with other people. And so there was a whole network of people that could be exposed if something went wrong. So it was very clear there that you had to work through people to help make that community more secure. You couldn't just do it with technology. The second moment for me was for about a decade, I was on the board of directors of an organization called FIRST. And FIRST stands for the Form of Incident Response and Security Teams. And it's actually one of the most understated organizations in security. As far as I can see, it's a nonprofit organization that brings together incident response teams from various companies. Adobe is a member, but many international government agencies are members, many universities are members. But what unites all of these different people is that they all work in incident response. They investigate security incidents, they respond to them, and they help figure out how to best deal with the issues. And you would expect when you go to their annual conference that you're going to learn about a lot of different tech. And that's definitely true. Like these organizations exchange techniques and ways of working and being more resilient against security incidents. But what I learned very quickly was that actually much more important than the tech was a community of people and how they work together. Having drinks or dinner with someone from that community and then later on being able to work together when there was actually a security incident allowed us to connect skills very, very effectively in ways that we didn't anticipate. So the tech often helped us solve the problems that we could see, where we knew the next issue was going to be. But the people were what helped incident responders solve the issues that they couldn't yet foresee. I just thought that was a really, really interesting discovery for me. And I think a lot of that continues to apply to AI because what really is unique about AI for me is that it allows people to become more multidisciplinary. So 10 years ago or 5 years ago, when I wanted to build something, I would have to find a developer. I would have to find someone who could write great documentation. I would have to find someone who had great skills in a particular technology. And we would work together to build a tool, to test something out. And often that didn't go anywhere. And then we had done all that work and needed to go and pivot to something else. And today, I can do a lot more of that independently by being more multidisciplinary by using AI. But there's a little challenge with that, and that is that I'm not an expert in any of those different areas. So I can't always vet and see what's actually a problem or a security problem in that space. So I think it's even more about people today, because security teams need to be really accessible to those individuals that are connecting those different skill sets using AI, so that we can help them do it safely. So I think, yeah, people will always be the core part of the equation in solving security problems.
Yeah, so I think it's great input. I think one of the things that I see even myself and across the organization or across the industry, people falling into the trap of is trying to use AI to find out how to or what other unique things there are to do, rather than realizing that technology has always been a means of making the average human better at something, right? And so we end up accidentally kind of turning it on its head and saying, "Hey, AI, tell me, some fun, innovative thing to do," and it actually ends up being counterproductive to us. And so, Marta, be curious to hear, when you talk to your colleagues and the people you've worked with, and you've been through all of these experiences, how do you keep that in mind, or how do you encourage the people maybe you mentor to keep in mind that, hey, technology is here to make us better at doing what humans are doing in their own judgment, and not the other way around?
So I think the core thing is actually being accessible to people. One of the things I've seen a lot of security orgs do that I think always backfires a little bit is you try to process everything. So what I mean is you try to build a process that deals with every question from everyone in the
Mm,
company. And you do that by putting together a bot that goes and responds to all of your developers that have questions. And I think the problem is that that bot may give perfectly fine technical output, but it's not going to really empathize and understand what the developer is trying to do. So I've always been an advocate of within the team having a lot of opportunities for others to access security and actually come and ask for input and come and work together. Because when I mentioned earlier, like I can do a lot more now as one individual by using AI. It's actually more I can experiment a lot more as an individual by using AI. But in the end, I'm still going to have to partner with others to make it reality, to actually make it into a production tool. And so being really, really accessible, I think is absolutely critical. And I think as security leaders, we actually have to model that. So when you're a very Slack heavy organization, I always tell people like, reach out to me. I may not get back to you within 2 hours. I cannot commit that because that's very busy, but I can absolutely like have a look at everything that comes in and engage with you and get you in touch with the right person to actually have a conversation about the issues that you have. So I think it's really that conversation where you learn what your developers are trying to do, and then you can give them input, and then that input will really have an effect. And you can also learn where then you can actually automate certain problems out of existence. Like, can you deal with certain tier one questions automatically? Can you actually intercept signups to a third party tool that you don't want to allow and actually redirect the user to something that you do want to use? So it's all about empathy there.
Well, I mean, that's why they talk about it in cybersecurity, really all technology. It's people, process, technology. And the first part is always people. That's what it starts first. It's not just an alphabetical list. It's the people are the reason we have processes and technology. Now, there might be some very challenging people that we need to put a good process or maybe leverage some technology or automation to help them in some ways. But at the end of it, it's because they're trying to do their job in whatever form, fashion, or version of it that it is. But let me ask you this question, Martin. You've seen the rise of artificial intelligence, probably, you've been in security long enough. You remember a pre-AI time. We're going to go back. We're probably all going to date ourselves and say, I remember a pre-AI cybersecurity world. And now we're in the post-AI cybersecurity world. But there's going to be this place for where automation is not going to automatically remove human judgment or insight or experience. Tell me about that interplay that you've seen, and where are we on that maybe tipping scale between AI's power and humans' ingenuity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would actually argue, like, I would not feel super comfortable saying I knew a pre-AI security world, because when I got started in security, like, machine learning was already a common technology to solve some very specific problems, right? Like when you think about spam filtering, And so, but yeah, the AI technologies and the large language models that we see today are of course, very, very different. So honestly, I think every process can benefit from human ingenuity. The problem that we have, though, is we do not have endless human ingenuity. Like, we cannot go and look at every process and dive in deeply to make everything better. So as security leaders, we need to decide which things we're going to automate, and we're okay with it having a minus grade on what it's going to do, and which are the areas where we're going to really invest our humans and figure out like how we can make the process better and truly get an A plus in that space. And maybe I can share with you some stories of where I've seen like AI do really, really well, based again on that human ingenuity of like, let's apply it here. Like, one of my favorites is actually something that we did at Adobe, and we have a few blogs about it. It's called ThreatForge. It's a tool that we actually make available to software developers to make better threat models. Because one of the biggest challenges with threat modeling is that you, generally speaking, don't have enough security engineers to join every software development team that's going to build a threat model. And that leads to the software engineers really thinking through what could the threats here be, which is not necessarily their area of expertise. So we used AI to actually help suggest threats that may apply to a particular tool, so that software developers can get that information, then think through the outcomes of how are they going to change the application to sort of mitigate some of those threats. And it allows us to scale threat modeling a lot more widely than we would have ever been able to just with people. Another favorite of mine was actually one that we did not see coming originally. So we have an AI-driven tool that does threat intelligence analysis. So when we learn about a blog, for instance, that talks about a product and describes an issue, we try to automatically analyze that and see, is there something here that we should actually go look at? And we launched that tool internally. We started using it to help our threat intelligence team understand better the threats that are out there. And one day, suddenly, that tool came back to us and said, here's this blog in French that explains this potential issue with your product. You should go look at it. And that was really eye-opening to me because I'm Belgian, so I happen to speak French very poorly, but I do. But most of the team does not actually speak French. And so it allowed us to scale the capabilities of the team well beyond what we would otherwise be able to do. And we also would be unlikely to go and staff up the team to match every language out there, right? So this in no way undoes the human work that actually goes into the analysis and understanding the problem, but it did actually allow us to scale in a direction we had not anticipated when we rolled out the little tool.
You guys weren't following that French language threat blog already and scanning it on a daily basis?
Well, so if we had, we wouldn't have been able to read the output. So that's really the problem. Now there's machine translation, all of these different things, but it is very convenient when you can actually have a system that helps you do this type of work. And so for me, that was really, really, really valuable. So what I actually see more is that the human ingenuity comes into place, figuring out like what are actually the spaces where we can still improve, where we are not doing as well as we should. And how do we then build some of the tooling to actually make that happen?
It's really interesting. I look at my time at Trace3 was very much focused on how to build programs. It started in cloud security, moved to cloud data security and just data security in totality, but it fit in hyper automation and governance and privacy and legal and all of these different components that are really, really hard to get working together in an organization. Security and engineers don't like governance or privacy. They don't move fast. And they're different brains, right? We hire different types of people for those different types of roles. And this question kind of feeds into the next question, Sam. I'm going to steal it from you here, which is, what does it look like to build a security program around the real needs of analysts and users? And the input that I'd like to share and get your thoughts on, Maarten, before that is, during this time, and this was only 3 or 4 years ago, we had the Cloud Security Alliance and a lot of other frameworks coming out and saying, hey, build your data security steering committee, build your cloud center of excellence, build your cloud security steering committee, your AI center of excellence, these areas where we were really encouraging organizations from an organizing perspective to organize themselves into committees so that they could get together and collaborate and push things forward. And then AI came into the room, and it seemed like it almost put a halt to all of that and dumped it on its head when we needed it most. And so from your perspective, and kind of in lieu of that question, how do you suggest organizations really get together and organize and evolve with that fast moving nature while servicing the needs of developers and security together and being accessible, like you said before?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think committees they add value, right? Like they bring together people that otherwise might not actually come together to solve a particular problem. I've actually applied that for many different problems. Like I remember when the COVID epidemic happened, or coronavirus. Like at that point in time, a lot of organizations brought together sort of a tiger team committee to make some really, really hard decisions that would be very hard to make from one skill set perspective, right? And I think AI is actually very similar. As these LLMs became more popular and organizations were trying to figure out how we govern this, committees were a logical way to bring together legal, privacy, security, developer experience, IT, and really plan through like what does this actually mean for the people that are working here and are working through these different issues. So I think there's a lot of value in doing that and having like that together. But that doesn't connect your organization. And I think that's sort of the gap that remains. And to me, to connect an organization, what you really need is you kind of need to have a very clear purpose of what you're there to do as an organization. For security teams, I have actually always liked the idea of having purpose statements for what we do, as opposed to mission statements, because a mission is sort of there's an ending to it, and you're going to get to it or you're not going to get to it. And sometimes when you don't hit the mark, then you have a problem. Whereas if you say the purpose that we are here for is to enable our organization to be resilient and everyone to have great options, even when things are a little bit harder, it kind of motivates people to sort of move forward. So align people around a purpose, around a direction, so they can see like where you're really, really going. But I think that openness that I mentioned earlier is actually the key. For me, all of this really does go back to starting with empathy. And I mentioned that as a leader, I try to model that behavior, like being both really accessible, but also being engaged in the forums that emerge when a company is dealing with a new issue. But second, I think it's also really important for the security organization to expose themselves in that way. And there's many different ways that you can do that. Like I've done it with a security champions program where you pick some people across the organization that are really aware of what their teams are doing. You bring them in discussions on some hard issues that they have, and then you figure out how to move things forward. And you use those people to sort of like instill those changes in the organization. Another way that organizations do it is by having security partners or even business information security officers, people that really understand a particular business and have those security um, discussions there. But in smaller organizations, it can even be as simple as office hours. The way you do it is really more dependent on how you can scale. But I think that access is really, really important. And when you have that level of access and conversation with the organization, something really beautiful tends to happen. It's that you can move from a top-down governance model where you tell everyone what to do, which is, I think, historically how a lot of security teams kind of needed to get to where they needed to get to more of a shared governance model where you say from the top, these are really critical issues and it's really important we get this right. And here are the security controls that we are going to put in place. Things like multi-factor authentication that's phishing resistant. But at the same time, you also acknowledge that a large number of security decisions that get made in the company are actually made by people on a day-to-day basis. And it hinges on when they share something, is it easiest to share it with everyone or is it easiest to share it with a small group? So how do you get to a place where you actually give guidance to those individuals so they can make good decisions, or you actually like give them preset secure defaults they can use and they can still deviate from it when they really need to, but you make it enticing for them to actually not go and do that. So having like that purpose, that vision, and then underneath it having a model where they can actually work with you to make things more secure, I think is critically important. There's one part of the CISA Secure by Design guidance that was published a few years ago that really, really struck me. It talked about this thing called nudging, which is something that we really underestimate in security programs. It's all about when a user is making an insecure decision, we can't always tell them you cannot do this, because there are certain things that they need to be able to do their work. But it's best if they only do it like 5 or 10% of the time and not make it the default. If we can have technologies and tools that in real time nudge the user and say, did you mean to do this? This is the risk that you're exposing us to as an organization. And here's some alternatives on how you can do it safely. That is really powerful, because then you can start make changes from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And I think, Landon, that goes a little bit to your question of like, how do you actually bring these things together? I think it's by getting everyone involved in security and not making security something that happens on the side, where they only see the negative effects when we're blocking them from doing something.
Yeah, that's not the perception you want security to have, is that you're just, as somebody here at mine says, you're the no machine. We don't want that to be the reality. And if I remember, one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was encouraging security and IT people, go spend a day sitting in that part of the business over there. Go sit with HR. Go sit with your business development team. Go, in healthcare, go sit on a nursing unit and watch how they actually use the systems and the tools. And you're going to learn an awful lot, and you're going to understand these people have, families and jobs and things that they care about, and they just want to do them to the best of their ability. They're usually not malicious. And I think that really does emphasize the need to be, as you would say, human focused or human centered
Yep.
in all of that together. But let's walk that through a little bit there, Maarten. When you approach this AI problem, a lot of times it's the business who is coming to security saying, we need to amplify XYZ, whatever that metric, KPI outcome that they're wanting. These AI tools are doing, or in fact, maybe even the other side, their users have already downloaded, installed, and are running and operating whatever AI tool across the system. What does a human-centric view of that look like to make sure that, one, they're doing it safely, and that, two, security is involved in that process from the front end so that the business can achieve its outcomes in a reasonable way?
Yeah, I think where a lot of organizations struggle today is even just having the visibility into that. So knowing where developers and teams are actually using these technologies. And I think that's where having these relationships can help us build that understanding. But there's a piece of governance there that just has to happen, where you have to have some control. And when I've rolled out AI programs, and what I've tried to always do was to make sure that there's enough space for people to experiment in a safe way, where they're not actually in any way harming the company, but they can do the things that they want to do to see if they actually work. So having things like sandboxes, having mechanisms where a developer can go use a new technology in a separate account where they don't actually have access to any type of data, that is significant for the organization, making sure that they use things like synthetic data in their experiments. And so really putting in place a program where you kind of collect what the use cases of people are. But if their use cases don't exceed a certain bar, which is a risk threshold you need to set as an organization, you just allow them to move forward with the experimentation. And the reason you do that is because you really want to put it in their mind that as they start figuring out which of these experiments are useful and they want to go and actually deploy them, they come back to you for additional guidance on how to do it safely. And that's then where organizations, I think, really need to think about, can they have specific environments where they go and deploy that AI, where we have things like a registry where we understand what MCP servers exist, what specific agent technologies are being used, how they are being configured. And that's then what you need to be able to offer to make sure that these teams actually do it safely. So I think there's a governance piece there that you do need to set from the top down. But ideally, you want a lot of experimentation to happen so that the developers can help you understand what the new tech is. Because one of the interesting things about AI is that we just don't have experts yet. There's a lot of people who are thinking about it and who are trying to figure out how to do this well, but there's absolutely not a way to just go and take a training and then be an AI security expert. You need to work with the developers, figure out how they're using the tech, and then figure out how they can do it more safely. It's actually a really fun time to participate in security because of all of these new questions.
No, it's interesting. We found when we were doing things like Copilot adoption, less engineering focus, so less deploying things like custom RAG or all these other types of like homebrewed applications, but something as simple as like adopting Copilot. What we realized as we were rolling out Copilot, doing some of these adoption programs and doing use case training and use case enablement to organizations was that users would often do less activity that was prone to be risky if we gave them more use cases or trained them on more use cases that were actually relevant to what they did every single day. They were less likely to go and stumble around and try to do something that was risky if we
Yeah.
gave them more tools to actually do what they actually wanted to do. And so I think like it's almost for me this concept of like it is better to overtrain people and then trust than it is to undertrain people and hope that they don't do something worse, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It goes to the technology, right? They're not accustomed to this type of technology, and so they have certain reservations. And the more information you give them to do it safely, and really importantly, I would say guardrails, because it shouldn't all be information, right? Like there's a set of guardrails that you need to deploy to make it safe for them. But then the more you educate them about it, the more they appreciate that, because it's a new technology. It makes people a little bit nervous. If you give them that guidance, it empowers them to do more.
And I mean, I don't know if you've been on LinkedIn lately, Martin, but there are plenty of AI experts available on LinkedIn. If you just want to listen and read and comment on their stuff, I'm sure they'll be
I
happy
must
to
be
take
behind on my
questions.
social media a little bit, Samuel.
Trust me, it's funny. It runs the gamut of
Yeah.
AI is the greatest thing that has ever happened to humanity, and it is going to solve every single problem ever conceived. And somehow, I don't know what the future looks like in a world where AI has solved every single problem, but that is where we will be living. Then obviously you have some of the doomsayers that are AI is terrible. It's killing, destroying, Skynet. Arnold's going to come back someday soon and tell us to stop. And it's just, they have all sides of the extreme. Of course, the truth is probably somewhere much closer to the middle. But what gets you excited as a technology thinker and security futurist in some ways? What gets you excited about what AI is going to be able to help us do?
Yeah, well, I'm honestly still making my mind up on a lot of it, but I can tell you sort of the one thing that I have realized that made me very excited about AI in security specifically. So I get asked a lot, like, do you think AI will make security worse or will it make it better? And those are like two very extremes, right? Like we all know in certain spaces it's going to be better, in others it's going to be worse. But I really do think that in an interesting way, like really good use of AI is almost indistinguishable from magic. Like you see certain things happen that you knew were going to be really hard before. And for me, the biggest difference is that historically, or actually AI, it speeds up attacks quite a bit, and it makes things like developing exploits for vulnerabilities will likely be a lot easier in the future. It will make a creation of really believable phishing pages a lot faster in the future. But really, what it does is it's sort of like scaling up the speed of doing all of these things. And in security, usually we try to focus on root causes, right? So, what is the root cause here? If we can address that, then we actually can deal with the increase in speed. Now, we haven't always been good at that as a security community, but that's absolutely like the target that we all have. Second, so that's a limitation, I think, of AI in some way. Second, what's really meaningful to me is that one of our biggest challenges in security historically has been sharing information effectively. I remember the days, and when I say that, I laugh a little bit because it still happens today, where everyone shared indicators in documents and just emailed them around, and weren't using protocols like sticks and taxi to get them like to flow around very quickly, right? But in the end, I think we have the indicator sharing somewhat down these days. What we are not yet good at as a community is sharing learnings and sharing the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we see being actually effective of adversaries. And guess what LLMs are actually really, really good at? They are really good at summarizing, and they are really, really good at deploying a certain persona to read something a certain way. So there's this really unique opportunity for us to take what we learn of something that didn't go very well, scale it rapidly to a wide variety of audiences, and get the right information to the right person to make a really strong security decision. So I actually do think there is a really big opportunity ahead of us where AI will help make security a lot better because will actually share the learnings in a very concrete way with teams that can actually take action on it. So if you have an incident, for instance, sharing all the details on that incident with everyone actually usually is quite challenging and really, really difficult. But if we can use AI to help pick out the different pieces that are relevant to different actors, whether it's the network admin that needs to go and deploy a block, the authentication admin that may need to look at a configuration, the data admin that needs to understand where certain data lives and how it is locked down, like it scales that a lot better. And so I think there's a really big opportunity there for AI to do great work for security.
Well, I think that's a fantastic use case for it because obviously, the other side is, learning from each other's incidents, from the near misses or the actual bad things that do happen. It's something I know most competent security leaders are very keen to do and to learn from. And so let me pivot this conversation a little bit. So we've talked about kind of this human centricity to security design. And obviously, it's one thing when you make friends with one of the business leaders in the company and they trust you. Hey, Maarten, look, we're trying to do this. I want to make sure I don't break the entire company by deploying this thing. But the thing that they're deploying is an AI agent of some
Mhm.
kind. And obviously it's all the rage. People are talking about it. Every company's got some form of AI agent, and you're smart enough to know the underlying architecture for that. But how do we build a kind of a human-centered design for these AI agents who will need access to the network, to the data repositories? They'll have an identity in your system. They'll need, privileges. They'll need whatever those tools are. Talk to me about building a design for an agentic future where humans and agents coalesce and work together.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I think it goes down to the deeper problem of non-human identities, which actually predates agents, but definitely has a very similar impact. Today, many applications interact with each other, and they interact with tokens or authentication credentials that are sometimes tied to a user account, but not always. And I think what we'll see with agents is it'll be less and less directly connected to a human user. And so the challenge with these identities is, generally speaking, they're ephemeral, they're privileged, and they're often issued by a third-party application that happens to not be your identity provider. And that is where I think the real challenge kind of arises, because the ability to have visibility into those credentials is limited. So it's hard for security leaders to really have that view, except today through these human relationships with the developers that are deploying them, or alternatively going to audit every application and understanding what lives there. Now, I think the good news is we kind of know what we need to achieve for those tokens, and it's not that different from what we already have in place in a lot of cases. We need to have a strong form of authentication. We need to have context that ties that token to something different than it just being a token, so that someone who gets access to the token can't just use it and go access a whole bunch of information. We need to rotate them frequently because we always need to assume that there's going to be some type of disclosure of that token, and we need fine-grained authorization. And then the question becomes like, how does that translate to an agent that may have a specific purpose, but that is not necessarily a human that has that access? And I think the biggest challenge there today is that these things, as I said earlier, live outside of identity platforms. So they get configured in these applications. Combined maybe with the fact that a lot of these interaction protocols for agents, they're still relatively immature when it comes to configuring authorization and having like a mature way of making sure that things can easily be revoked, but also access can easily be changed. So I think there, the human problem for me is actually more, how do we sit together and develop the right protocols and the right systems to be able to do that? And there's a lot of work happening on that. The MCP spec is being updated to cover a lot of those challenges. I think a really interesting thing is also the authentication changes that are being made in OAuth to actually allow
Mhm.
cross-app access, so that you can actually pull back some of these authentications back to one of your centralized platforms, so you can do things like validate what is actually out of the ordinary here. Like, are we seeing a connection now to a particular endpoint where data is being retrieved that has never before been retrieved? That's a use case that's very unusual. And then I always think there's going to have to be some way of more quickly checking in with teams that own specific agents. What was actually the purpose of that agent being put into place? And does this still match what is actually being done there? And so maybe there's a mechanism there that we need to be able to block certain things when they're not looking entirely right. And then being able to sort of feedback, is this normal? Get that input back in and have a sort of a more living mechanism of understanding what these agents really are intended to do. So a lot of it builds on those relationships, but there are some technical things that we're going to have to figure out as a security community, as an authentication and authorization community, specifically to figure out how do we actually implement that safely. But going back to something I said earlier, I think today for a lot of organizations, it's actually visibility, understanding what lives where and what exists, so that we could then start evaluating like how are these things actually operating, and then work with those teams to understand this agent is now taking on a role that we probably wouldn't have seen from a human in the past. What does that actually mean?
Mhm. It's interesting, I look at the evolution of SSPM as a market category, Obsidian and Rico and a few of our friends and all the other competitors in that space. And it was kind of in the rise of kind of the NHI, 3, 4 years ago. It's like, this is a big problem. It still is a big problem that is a little bit further than SASE could handle traditionally. And now it seems like there's a coalesce of where identity and SSPM need to start coming closer together. Like the IDP itself needs to serve as a gateway for multi-app access, but it needs to be really closely tied to the SSPM capability itself. So I'll make my prediction now. I wonder if IDP companies will start to acquire and pull in more SSPM functionality as time goes on.
Interesting. I think the combination of those two tools are going to get very powerful for organizations. Because the SSPM essentially gives you the visibility, but also in many cases, the workflows of actually addressing insecure configurations, ways that these operations are being set up. But I do think in the end, we want more control over those interconnections between applications. And I think that is probably going to be an extension in some ways on what they do. So I can see how you're getting there in terms of what you're thinking.
I mean, you think in the network space, we have great, handshake protocols that allow us to open up secure sockets and channels and all that kind of stuff. And I agree with you, Maarten. We don't have that quite yet for these, app to app, agent to agent, MCP. It's cool and new, but what are the standard ways that we're going to kind of, as an industry, start leveraging that data flowing back and forth? And then what controls can we build into that? So we have an opportunity to maybe build early with a good secure framework around it, so that we can have a little bit of not just visibility, but also some, like you said, the ability to hit the stop button and change things when we're noticing, hey, the HR agent is all of a sudden looking at actual customer records, which it should not be doing, and being able to have a quick trigger on those kind of actions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think having that visibility into those cross app connections is going to be critical to be able to do that. Absolutely.
And then finally, Maarten, I'll just give you the last kind of words here as we're wrapping up our time. And I love these kind of conversations, because it's, we're talking about things that are in the future, but at the end of the day, and I think Landon said it well, this technology advancements that we're seeing and observing, and in some ways marveling at, in some ways worrying about, and it's that balance. I think a good balanced approach to it. These technology innovations are designed to help people do their jobs better with more creativity, ingenuity, effectiveness, speed, whatever the outcome is. So, Maarten, why don't you just summarize for us this human centricity of AI security? Why is it important? And if you were to advise security leaders on building the right kind of people, process, and technology systems, what kind of advice would you give them?
So I think the human approach or the human-centric approach to security is really critical, because in the end, our technology environments are always going to be changing, and they're going to be driven by human needs. And there's a risk that security teams have that are going to be behind the change. because security solves a problem, they feel good about it, and then they move on to the next problem. But if your organization and the way you do things is changing rapidly, security often ends up running behind the facts. I think organizations may have experienced that with the cloud, with more employees working from home, and now with AI. But if you're in close contact and tied into your engineering teams and your employees in general, you can see those changes coming and you can be agile in how you think about security. And so for me, it's really all about making sure that security teams accept that they're learning organizations and their world is going to change overnight all the time, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. And so there's three things that for me are really critical for any organization that I lead. The first one is that focus on learning, and part of that is training. But as we talked about, not every training is available all the time when a new technology comes out. So it's also about enabling the security team to experiment safely, but try new things and figure out how they can become experts in a space that's new. The second one is being multidisciplinary. So I've always loved disciplinary organizations. And in fact, when you think about it, when during World War II, when the British intelligence service cracked the Enigma cipher, they didn't do that with the best cryptographers. They did that with a whole bunch of really, really talented chess players and with someone that was working on this brand new idea that was called computing. And they spoke to a whole bunch of Polish code breakers who had made it really far along but hadn't quite gotten there yet. They put all of that together and then they actually cracked Enigma and achieved their goal. And I think the lesson in that for me is hire some people from very different backgrounds and see how they think about the problem and use what they share to make the organization better. And then finally, going back to what I mentioned about purpose earlier, let's make sure that as organizations, we're focused on resilience because sometimes things are not going to work out exactly the way that you planned. And how do we deal with that in the best way possible? And if the security team can help answer that question, I think it's infinitely more powerful than succeeding at locking everything down, but also in some way closing down on innovation. So those would be for me like the three big things: focus on learning, being a multidisciplinary org, and focusing on resilience first.
Yeah, I love that story of the Enigma cipher. Oh my gosh, what is the name of that movie where they portrayed that story? I'm blanking on the name of it now.
Is it the thinking
Is it?
game? I totally lost the
Yeah,
but it's a really
uh,
good one. I highly recommend if you.
fantastic movie. Yeah, and didn't they solved it because the Germans would broadcast like the daily weather at the start of their broadcast, and they were able to pick out and say date or time or something like that, and they were able to then use that to get further down the road with the rest of the cipher. So it just, you're right, you don't think of that if you're just a cipher breaker, but if you have a multidisciplinary approach, so that's fantastic.
There are lots of interesting stories in cryptography about people, reusing the same cipher in places where they shouldn't have, and that then leads to like really bad impact on them. Or the
And
same.
I will pick on your first point, being a learning organization. I don't think you need that anymore. Just go on LinkedIn. There's plenty of people that will tell you about how 99% of people are using AI wrong, and here's what you should do instead. So no need to be learning anymore. LinkedIn's got it figured out. Those experts there, they're top shelf. They're going to solve it all for you.
You can just ask ChatGPT what you need to do, and you can go off and do it.
There you go. Yeah, perfect. Problems all solved. We can go on from there. So, Maarten, it has been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much for helping to ground the conversation around AI, future, security, all of these things at the core fundamental tenets of there are still people that we still have to interact with, and we still have to engage them and make sure we are, as a security organization, taking care of the people that are a part of our business, and also, I'm sure, a part of your security teams as well. So, Maarten, thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Samuel, and thank you so much, Landon.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And for Landon Brown, for Maarten Van Horenbeeck, my name is Samuel Hill, and that's all for now.